Good evening. Welcome. Welcome panelists signing on right now, and welcome everyone watching at home to tonight's event, What to Do About China, Taiwan and the Future of US-China Relations. I'm Kevin Marinelli, Executive Director of the Program for Public Discourse. As you know, the past couple weeks have been marked by horrific violence and fraught with geopolitical tensions that make tonight's debate all the more timely and important. So it's an honor to have such an esteemed panel of experts to help walk us through some of these challenging topics and questions that we have before us. But before I turn it over to them, I do want to bring your attention to a few things. First, I want to let you know that we want to hear from you as well. So we encourage you to put your questions into the Q&A, and we'll do our best to get to as many audience questions as we can before the evening is through. We also want to let you know that this event will be posted on our YouTube channel, so we encourage you to watch it again or recommend it to anyone who isn't able to attend tonight. And finally, there'll be a very brief survey toward the end of tonight's event that we encourage you to take to let you know or let us know how we're doing. So now I'd like to introduce our panelists. June Dreyer is Professor of Political Science at the University of Miami. Formerly the Senior Far East Specialist at the Library of Congress, Dr. Dreyer has also served as Asia Policy Advisor to the Chief of Naval Operations and as Commissioner of the United States-China Economic and Security Review Commission established by the US Congress. Professor Dreyer has published widely on China-Taiwan relations. Yu-Chua Huang is the Kuomintang representative in Washington, D.C., and formerly served as the party's spokesperson and Deputy Director of International Affairs. Huang joined the KMT party headquarters in 2014 and served as the international spokesperson for the KMT's presidential candidate during Taiwan's 2016 and 2020 presidential campaigns. Shelley Rigger is Brown Professor of Political Science at Davidson College. Her current research studies the effects of cross-strait economic interactions on Taiwan's people's perceptions of mainland China. Dr. Rigger's monograph, Taiwan's Rising Rationalism, Generations, Politics, and Taiwan Nationalism, was published by the East-West Center in Washington. And finally, our moderator tonight, Klaus Larres, is Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor at UNC. He is an expert on security policies toward the transatlantic world, China, and Southeast Asia. Dr. Larres writes and lectures on post-Cold War geopolitics, US foreign policy, European integration, and the complex interactions that shape the US, EU, Germany, China triangle. And with that, I will hand it over to our moderator, Klaus Larres, to moderate the evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. It's a pleasure to be here. I would like to welcome you, the audience. I would like to welcome all our distinguished panelists. I'm joining you tonight from Washington, D.C., and we are a very international audience, I noticed tonight, with many people who have joined us across the world. And of course, our panelists have joined us from different parts of the United States. I would like to welcome everyone to our event on what to do about China, Taiwan, and the future of US-China relations. Of course, we will also talk about the terrible war in Ukraine and China's position toward Russia and the war. Our event tonight is organized by the UNC Program for Public Discourse and the Carolina Asia Center, and of course by the Krasno Global Event Series, which have been running since 2012. And I noticed quite a few loyal followers of the Krasno Global Event Series have joined us tonight. Incidentally, our next Krasno event is on April the 19th, when the representative of Northern Ireland in Washington, D.C. will join us. Tonight, we have three outstanding experts: Professor June Dreyer of the University of Miami and Professor Shelley Rigger of Davidson College in North Carolina, and Yu-Chua Huang of Washington, D.C. We will ask and try to answer many of the crucial questions in connections with US-China relations and the Taiwan question. For example, we will ask, is the war in Ukraine a wake-up call for Taiwan? How did democracy develop in Taiwan? And how did Taiwan become such an economic powerhouse, which it is today? Is Taiwan likely to declare independence? Will China take over Taiwan forcefully? And how would the United States react? And there are, of course, many other questions we will ask and hopefully, you, the audience, will ask as well. To remind everyone briefly, you may remember that the Nixon administration's so-called opening to China in the early 1970s led to the diplomatic recognition of the People's Republic of China on the Chinese mainland by the Carter administration in 1979. Taiwan lost its formal recognition by the United States and soon also by many other countries, and also its UN seat. Since then, US-Taiwanese relations have been defined by the Taiwan Relations Act, enacted by the US Congress in 1979, and since 2018, also by the Taiwan Travel Act. Also, the so-called Six Assurances of 1982 by the Reagan administration expressed US support for Taiwan, despite the cutting off of formal diplomatic relations in 1979. In particular, the military cooperation between the United States and Taiwan has been and still is controversial, both within the United States and, of course, in Beijing. The nature of US policy toward Taiwan has been characterized as strategic ambiguity. The 1979 Taiwan Relations Act states, and I quote, that the United States will make available to Taiwan such defense articles and defense services in such quantity as may be necessary to enable Taiwan to maintain sufficient self-defense capabilities. However, this is very vague, and what this means precisely and in practice is entirely unclear. In fact, the Act states that it is the decision of the President and the Congress to decide the nature and the quantity of defense services that the United States will provide to Taiwan. Washington's policy of strategic ambiguity is meant to dissuade Taiwan from declaring independence, and it is meant to dissuade Beijing from trying to unify Taiwan and mainland China by force. Of course, we will elaborate much more on this very brief summary of the current state of the problem regarding Taiwan and US relations with Beijing. We will begin our event tonight with short 5-minute presentations on the current state of Taiwan and US-Chinese relations by each of our distinguished speakers. I will then pepper them with a few questions and interrogate our speakers a little bit. We will then turn to questions from you, the audience. Please submit your questions in writing by using the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Kevin will be so kind as to select the questions and read them out aloud. Needless to say, we will not be able to answer all your questions, but hopefully as many as possible. Welcome again to our event tonight, What to Do About China, Taiwan and the Future of US-Chinese Relations. I would like to ask our first speaker, Professor Shelley Rigger of Davidson College, to make her initial opening remarks. Over to you, Shelley.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I want to thank the organizers and also the other participants. The question as it was presented to us for the purpose of a debate is what to do about China, Taiwan, and the future of US-China relations. And this question, I think, implies that Taiwan should be a consideration in US-China policy. So in good debater form, I will start by rejecting the premise of the question itself. Instead, I will argue that the US should have a Taiwan policy that recognizes its implications for US PRC relations and a policy toward the People's Republic of China that is made in that same frame. US foreign policy reflects America's interests and values. These are the same whether we're talking about Taiwan, the PRC, Russia, Ukraine, or any other country or international institution. My time is short, so I will speak to 2 interests and 1 value. Number 1, the US has an interest in peace and stability, especially for itself and for its allies and partners. Number 2, the US has an interest in a global economy in which Americans and others can flourish and prosper in a sustainable and non-predatory way. And number 3, the US values democracy and human rights, including the right of peoples to establish and defend self-determination under many, although not all, circumstances. So how should those interests and values inform US policy toward the PRC? Regarding its interest in peace, the US should maintain the capacity and resolve to deter and, if necessary, to counter violations of its allies and partners' sovereignty and freedom of action by the PRC. As for its economic interests, the US should provide global public goods to support well-functioning markets, including high-quality trade agreements that protect labor, the environment, and states' ability to collect revenue. And in terms of its values, the US should speak out forcefully on behalf of human rights in the PRC, and it should defend democracy, sovereignty, and freedom of action for the PRC's neighbors. Okay, so how should those interests and values inform US policy toward Taiwan? To defend peace and stability, the US should continue its efforts to help Taiwan maintain a credible defense, including holding open the possibility of US military intervention in the event of an unprovoked attack. In this regard, Taiwan is different from Ukraine, which the US has never identified as a state it might defend with direct military force. The US has never committed itself unconditionally to Taiwan's defense, but it also has never ruled out the possibility of defending Taiwan directly. Economically, the US should encourage international agreements that include Taiwan whenever possible, and Taiwan companies when it's not possible to include Taiwan as a country. And that includes agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. The US itself should be a good trading partner by, for example, refraining from pressuring Taiwan to import American products that don't meet global standards. To be consistent with its values, America's Taiwan policy must allow Taiwanese people to decide for themselves what their future relationship with China in general, and the PRC in particular, should be. It must respect Taiwanese people enough to be honest about the risks of certain actions and the limitations of US power. So far, nothing I've said is very controversial, I think. So to put a point on this debate, I will say a little bit about what I am not for. As US PRC tensions escalate, the US must not slip into viewing Taiwan as a strategic asset to be used against the PRC. The 24 million people living on Taiwan are not a weapon, and they do not belong to us. They should make their own decisions. That is not to say that the US should make an unconditional guarantee of Taiwan's security. Washington should be honest with Taiwan's leaders and people about what it can and cannot deliver so that they can make decisions with complete information. The US should not press or encourage Taiwan to provoke the PRC. Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo came perilously close to that with his statement that the US should support Taiwan independence. Whether that statement was motivated by vanity or hatred of the PRC, I don't know, but it was dangerous because it implied a promise that the US may not be able to keep. As we are seeing in Ukraine, war is the worst case scenario. For Taiwanese, as for the people of Ukraine, there is no defense that can prevent massive suffering and destruction in war. And that would be true even if the US intervenes and Taiwan ultimately succeeds in defending itself. So that's my statement. I thank you very much for your attention and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much, Shelley. That was most interesting. Tell me, and perhaps you can clarify that a little bit. What is your standpoint on the one China policy and the two China policy? Because some of your remarks initially, particularly at the beginning, seem to go towards a two China standpoint, while toward the end, you seem to kind of roll that back. Perhaps you can explain that to us.
So the US has a one China policy. It has had a one China policy since 1972, really, with the Shanghai Communique, in which we said, you know, all you Chinese people agree that there's one China and Taiwan is part of it. We are not going to challenge that position. Mm-hmm. So the US position is that there is apparently one China, that is the the stated view of the governments on both sides at the moment when the US made that statement. However, it is clear that the relationship between whether they are parts of one China or whether they are parts of an entity which has in the past imagined itself to be one China and is in transition or flux towards something else today. The reality that we face is that the two sides of the Taiwan Strait are governed separately. And so the US has relationships officially with the PRC and unofficially, but very importantly with Taiwan. So what I would say is that the one China policy has allowed the US to sustain its relations with mainland China without actually abandoning Taiwan and without creating a dynamic in which Taiwan is sort of fatally at odds with the government in Beijing.
Thank you. So if Taiwan, for some reason or whatsoever, were inclined to go for independence, the US should do its best to prevent that?
I think that the danger of Taiwan going for independence is slim. I've been watching Taiwan public opinion closely since the early 1980s and really closely since the early 1990s. And I don't see evidence that Taiwan would make a move for independence because Taiwanese well understand the risk associated with such a move. What troubles me sometimes is more statements or actions by governments or actors, sometimes non-governmental actors in the US that seem to imply that the US is moving away from a one China policy, even when Taiwan is working hard to maintain some kind of flexibility or ambiguity on that front.
Okay, thank you very much. More, I'm sure, about that later in our discussion. Our next speaker is Eric Yu-Chua Huang. He is a representative of the Kuomintang in Washington, D.C. And of course, the Kuomintang is the nationalist party on Taiwan and the largest opposition party. Over to you, Eric.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. And I'm truly honored to be here today with this very established group of panelists. So though this is a debate forum, but I feel like I agree with almost everything Shelley just said. So let me attack this issue from a Taiwan's perspective and how some discussions has changed in Taiwan in recent years, given the evolving nature of US-China relations. So you're absolutely right. The KMT, though some might argue that we are a pro-China party, but we are a 100% pro-Taiwan party. But given our historical history, we used to be a Chinese nationalist party. And that is part of the world's effort of fighting communism. So when the KMT retreated to Taiwan, when we were defeated by the Chinese Communist Party, and now we rule Taiwan. And for a big part, until the early 1980s, when after Nixon opened the doors with China, Taiwan was the defender of free China, and we largely tried to hold the line of the first island chain against the Chinese. And so after this opening reapproachment with the Chinese, Taiwan began its business activities with mainland China. And that went on thriving. And I think that helped both the Chinese and Taiwan's economy in the early 1990s, 2000, and things has changed in the recent years. For my observation, though I can be wrong, I think there are a number of reasons for that change. One is obviously what I just mentioned, ideologies, democracy versus authoritarian regime. Second, it could be security, since if given the nature of CCP, Chinese Communist Party, they might have security ambitions in the region, and that implicates Taiwan to a large extent. And thirdly is obviously economy, right? So Taiwan stands in the middle of all three of these, right in the middle, actually. So if for the Americans to pivot to Asia, and if its main security concern becomes mainland China, Taiwan is facing a choice to make. And I think some of the Taiwanese people in recent elections are framing the issue in that direction. The 2020 election being a big example, even though I might disagree with some of the voters' decisions, but the main topic is about which candidate can provide better security for Taiwan in face of Beijing's threat. And so make no mistake, we do see this as a threat, and we have to manage this threat and reduce this problem as we go along. So American comes in the picture as one of our, if not the most important strategic ally and security provider. So Taiwan, with our geopolitical location and with our history, we work very closely with mainland China in terms of business. We have over 1.5 million people living there doing business every day, and it is our biggest export partner. But nevertheless, we share the same value with Americans. We are a democracy, and we do not want to be forcefully taken over by Beijing. And Beijing hasn't given up that option on the table. So two events recently has prompted the discussion of Taiwan's future and how we can be more self-reliant on our security. Number one is what Shelley mentioned, former Secretary Pompeo's visit, where he raised a very interesting discussion whether or not U.S. should formally, officially recognize the Republic of China, Taiwan, as a diplomatic ally. Second is the issue of Ukraine, which I'm sure we will go to a discussion a bit later. So the Ukraine has prompted the discussion of how can Taiwanese defend our country better, whether or not we should go back to conscription, or should we have a better reserve mechanisms where people can be mobilized more quickly in the event of this happen. Though KMT's position on this is Taiwan should never have to really think about going to a warfare. We should stop warfare at any cost. That is peace through strength. So we need to be better prepared for how we can defend ourselves. So the second discussion prompted by this is whether or not the US will come to Taiwan's aid in such an event. I think Shelley did a great job to characterize that in the event of unprovoked by Taiwan, the US will come to some kind of aid. But I think in this discussion, especially in the frame of strategic ambiguity, this helps the Taiwanese people better to understand we need to be self-reliant. And then if Americans come to our aid, we can see that as a plus. So these are good discussions, I think, for Taiwanese nowadays. And I'll just very quickly, for the interest of time, I think in terms of economy, Taiwanese are making a choice as well, whether or not people will see mainland China as still the first option as a business partner. I think things are been changing. I'll give you one interesting example. In a referendum last year, December of last year, the Taiwanese went to the ballots to vote on ragtopin import, imported from the rest of the world and the United States. Every poll has suggested the majority of Taiwanese are against such an import, but I think the ruling party DPP did a great job of framing this issue as a national security problem with America. So I think that has stopped the voter turnout somewhat. So as a result, this referendum did not take to its effect because he didn't pass the threshold of 25% of the voters. So I think these are examples of discussions in Taiwan. Though I'm not as optimistic as Shelley that Taiwanese people will not pursue independence, de jure independence.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Can I just ask you and follow up on that? What about the domestic demographic situation in Taiwan? Apparently, younger people are much less interested in relations with the Chinese mainland than with Western countries, while older Taiwanese people still have a greater nostalgia for mainland China. Can you confirm that?
Yes, I think that's a great question. I think that first of all, the generational gap is a reality. It exists. However, I think the problem is more complicated than how we are tackling this issue. I think, quite frankly, I'll give you an example. I think William Lai, Vice President William Lai, in a recent remark, he said basically that Taiwan needs to have a good business partnership with Beijing. So this nationalistic feelings about Beijing is changing among young people. This is what we call a national identity development and progression. An older generation, especially the ones who came with the Kuomintang in 1949, ethnically we identify with China, but it's not to say we align with the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. So the younger generation having a harder time to understand. I think the concept is close to the Westphalian national building. So having a hard time to understand, though we might, as some people might not, identify as culturally Chinese, it doesn't mean that Taiwan has to be part of CCP, and it doesn't mean that we have a same way of life, right? I think another debate in Taiwan is what's Taiwan's responsibility to democratize mainland China, and I think this is a topic that KMT would like to raise in the future. So this generational gap is real in Taiwan, and I think the younger generation, as you described it, just really want to mind our own way of life. And in terms of cross-strait relations, I think even though they know it's important, but they view it in a different lens.
Thank you. Thanks very much indeed. Now we come to our third speaker, that is June Dreyer of the University from Miami. And June will give us her initial opening remarks about the situation in US-Chinese relations, and particularly regarding Taiwan. You're muted. Could you unmute yourself? Yeah. Hello.
Now you can hear me.
Yes, that's much better.
Thank you for that nice introduction, and it's my great pleasure to be here with you all. Now, Eric was saying he knew it was going to be a debate, but he really didn't have any disagreements with Shelley. And so I think it's incumbent on me to start some debate. And
absolutely.
Let me just start out by saying that I thought the 1972 consensus was a disaster, and that it is one with severe consequences for not only US-China relations today, but also for the people of Taiwan. And I think that the idea of one China was always a sham. And as John Holdridge, who was at that time Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the Pacific, said, but what about the people of Taiwan? He understood that there were a lot of people on Taiwan who did not consider themselves Chinese, and they just kind of got ignored. And very interesting, and if any of you have access to academic journals, I would commend this to your attention. Nancy Burnkoff Tucker, the late Nancy Burnkoff Tucker, was able to examine all the declassified documents relevant to the 1972 quote consensus, and she came to the conclusion that it did not need to happen. The wording did not need to be the way it was. So somehow we regard the idea of one China as more sacred than the sacred cow. I don't think it is, and I don't think it should be regarded that way. What was a bad idea in 1972 is an even worse idea now that Taiwan has become a democracy, and now that our hopes, which certainly seemed plausible, not in 72, but certainly in 1979, that China would become a democracy, it's just not happening. I would also like to see an end of this, will Taiwan declare independence? And thank you, Eric, for clarifying that that's de jure independence that you're talking about. Because in fact, Taiwan has no need to declare independence. It's already independent. And we have to get rid of some of these ambiguities are convenient. Many of them are not. And I know Shelley said we should encourage Taiwan's participation in the CPTPP and the ICAO and the World Health Organization and so on, where possible. Well, it's not possible. So what do we do then? Curl up and say it's not possible, so we're not going to try. And so I have objections to that. And to me, the real trick going forward with Chinese-American relations is how can we extricate ourselves from this sham of a one China policy without totally repudiating it? And I think the answer there can be seen in the way the Japanese operate. They signed on to Article 5 of the Constitution, which forbade the use of the military. They now have a self-defense force. You see what I'm saying? You can change things. They also had a self-imposed moratorium. They couldn't sell arms abroad. They have changed that. And I think I'm not saying, okay, one China policy is at an end. I am not saying that. I am saying that we need to change our attitude. And in many ways, we have been. We do not formally recognize the Republic of China on Taiwan, but de facto, we treat it as an independent country, okay? We make certain concessions. The Marine Guard at the US non-embassy in Taipei does not wear uniforms. And we call Xiaobi Kim the representative, except for those of us who call her the ambassador, and she does not object. And so that's what I'm talking about, the gradual moving away from trying to observe the, what I call the improper spirit of the 72 Shanghai Communique and the reality that is today. And we've been talking about Sino-American relations, Sino-American Taiwan relations, but let's not forget there are other countries involved in this too. And one of them is Japan. And in fact, most vitally for Japan, since if China were to take over de facto Taiwan, its territorial waters would bump right against Japan's southernmost island, Japan's island of Yonaguni. There is no way they want that. And people in Taiwan have, many of them remember fondly the Japanese. And they can be very supportive. I, a couple of years ago, went with a retired Japanese diplomat to Taiwan, and he wanted to see Falun Gong. So we went to the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial, and I asked, because he didn't speak any Chinese. He speaks Arabic and English and lots of other things. So I asked in Chinese where we can find the Falun Gong. And he and his entourage, meanwhile, are speaking in Japanese. And the guy I talked to, his face lit up it was like an electric bulb. And he started speaking to Okazaki-san in Japanese. He said, "Let me take you to Falun Gong." And darn it, they didn't all speak Japanese as well. And I mean, this is the kind of rapport. And you see this in Morris John, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, now setting up a plant in Kumamoto. And this is, in a way, an insurance policy for Taiwan's computer chip industry, setting up that plant. And we need to act on this. A couple of days ago, the Japanese former Prime Minister Abe said it's really time we started talking about nuclear arms for Japan. And to my shock, Nihon Ishi no Kai's president said, "Yeah, we really should." Now, he was slapped down 2 days later on that one, but Abe still continues. So let's be honest. We got a bad deal in 1972. In 79, we got the derecognition of the Republic of China on Taiwan. But at least in Carter's defense, it looked at that point as if China would democratize. You now have the exact opposite situation.
Thank you. Thank you, June. Yeah, thank you very much. I fully understand what you're saying. You're not in favor of what happened in the 1970s, but we have committed the United States legally for the last 50 years to a one China policy. And whether you like it or not, if we now go back what various American governments have done for the last 50 years, couldn't that be called dishonest? Couldn't that be called not reliable? You enter into a legal commitment, and if you don't like it anymore, a few decades later, you decide to tear it up and go back. This is not what legal reliability is all about in international affairs, is it?
I would argue that a communique is not illegal.
No, but the independence, the diplomatic recognition in 1979 definitely is. This is an international treaty with everything which belongs with it. And also, you know what I mean, I don't need to explain that to you. So we have entered into legal commitments of a one China policy. And of course, we can agree whether that's great or whether that was a mistake, but we cannot just go back and undo it, can we? You know, then we could tear up all sorts of legal treaties.
I am not arguing that we should undo it legally. I am saying we should move away from treating it as the sacred cow. And, you know, it's true, there isn't a one China, or perhaps I could modify that. There is a one China and there is a Taiwan.
Mm-hmm. So does that mean, to clarify?
As we're moving away from commitments, if we had an hour and a half, I could give you a list of commitments that have been moved away from. For example, China, when it was angry with the Soviet Union, supported Japan's right to the return of the 4 Northern Territory islands. And it then moved away from it, and it said, we never promised that, except they did.
Okay, I accept that. Yeah.
As we're moving away from commitments, whether they're legal or not, when they're no longer convenient, I would call this diplomacy.
No, well, but you have to understand that the other side, whoever it is, whether it's China or a European country, would not be impressed by that. But let's open your question to—
Why do we care?
No.
Why do we care if they're impressed or not? President Xi Jinping.
Let me bring in the other discussants, okay? Shelley, how would you respond to what June just suggested?
I would say we have to, I agree that the origins of the Shanghai Communique and the position that the US took is really problematic, and less because of the position we took in the Shanghai Communique, or that the US leaders took, than because the Shanghai Communique was really the best of what went on between Kissinger, Zhou Enlai, and Nixon and Mao. You know, we know that thanks to Nancy Berncroft Tucker's work that June mentioned a moment ago, we know that especially Henry Kissinger, the National Security Advisor, reassured Zhou Enlai and other PRC leaders that things would work out for them with Taiwan. He never said, we'll hand it over, but he let them know that the US was not committed to the defense of Taiwan. So it's against that backdrop that agreeing not to challenge the stated position of, at that time, both governments, Taiwan and the PRC, is actually, it's a whole lot better than the direction things were headed when those interactions first began. However, it shapes our relationship with the PRC to this day, and the US to retreat significantly from those commitments would be offering the PRC an opportunity also to retreat from its commitments and to abandon the kind of framework that has held the US and the PRC in some kind of stable and, to a significant extent over time, cooperative relationship. So, I think it's an attractive thought, but I think there would be consequences for US-China relations, and there would be huge consequences for Taiwan. And that's really what I would want to call attention to is, the US needs to consider the ramifications of its actions for Taiwan if it is on Taiwan's behalf that we claim to be making these changes.
Thank you very much. We have so many things to cover, and our audience, I know, wants to know also about whether or not there is a parallel between Taiwan and Ukraine, or Ukraine and Taiwan. Has the war in Ukraine made Taiwan less secure or more secure? Does China conclude from the war in Ukraine that any forceful action against, for example, Taiwan would not be wise, or would it come to the opposite conclusion, or something in between? Can you help us regarding this question? Maybe June again, and then we come to Eric.
Well, actually, the PRC itself has said that there is not a connection between Taiwan and what goes on in the Ukraine. It was very, very critical of Peter Dutton, the Australian defense minister, and of Scott Morrison, the prime minister, for making a comparison. And it said the comparison with Taiwan is deliberately equalizing two very different affairs with ulterior motives. And it didn't say what those ulterior motives were, but it is trying to, I think what the speaker, which is this firebrand ex-editor of the Global Times, had in mind, was that this is going to be used by the United States to form a coalition against the People's Republic of China.
Right.
And as any number of people have pointed out, the situation with Ukraine is totally different, because you could kind of melt the Russian army across the borders, and there's a lot of water in the way with it. So I don't see the parallels, but I think that it is useful to bring up the issue of, is China going to attack Taiwan?
Okay, let's ask Eric about it. Let's see what Eric has got to say about it.
Well, I think the first observation has to go to how the Chinese react to this situation in Ukraine. Do they try to come in to be a more mediator, or do they try to work with the Russians or with the Western allies? And I think so far they have tried to stay on the sideline as much as possible. And I think if I was Xi Jinping, I will very soon realize that Putin isn't a very reliable partner in any sense. So flowing from this, coming to my second point, I think this somehow makes Taiwan more secure in the international community, because Chinese now realizes everybody's watching. I think those economic sanctions do work on the invader in any event. And second is the support. Beijing can have a sense of the support Taiwan will get, or how this will tarnish its reputation in the event if unprovokedly Beijing start a military conflict with Taiwan. And thirdly, is what I mentioned earlier. I think now Taiwanese people have this conscious of being a self-reliance. We know, we have been in years talk about how we need to beef up our defense, spend more money, talk about conscriptions, and it just was just a non-debate discussion. But now people realize that this can happen. So I think it go back to the default position. Everybody should be more reasonable on Taiwan Strait, and though nobody want war to happen, but I think this is a good reminder that it could happen.
Quick follow-up question. Do you think that Beijing could be a good mediator in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, as the Chinese foreign minister has suggested, or is this totally unrealistic?
I don't think they will be a good one, but nevertheless, they're in position to be one. Mm-hmm. I think to be a mediator, first of all, both sides have to somehow respect their reputation and their weight. And I think other than the Western countries today, China is one of the biggest countries, and they have pre-existing relations with Russia. And somehow, if this can happen, my hope is maybe the Chinese and the Americans can better their relations, and this is obviously better, a good thing for cross-strait relations as well. I think this is a long shot, but yeah.
Let me bring Shelley in on this question as well, and then we open it up to questions from the audience. Please, Shelley.
Yeah, I think it's been really interesting to see how observers have reacted on this question of Ukraine versus Taiwan, because there are those who look at it and say, wow, Russia has opened the box. Naked aggression is back. And so China's going to try it. And then there are those who say, this naked aggression is not working out for Russia. And everything about the way this war has unfolded, I think it has been surprising to nearly everyone. I don't know anyone who predicted, one, that Russia would actually invade, two, that the Ukrainians would mount a credible defense, three, that the rest of the world would come together and forget about all the stuff that we were fighting over, 2 weeks ago, and four, that economic sanctions would actually tank the Russian economy in short order. So while I think it is still possible for Russia to win in some kind of very localized and specific way, perhaps by capturing the capital or even, heaven forbid, the leadership of Ukraine, I think the long-term consequences of this invasion are unlikely to be anything but overwhelmingly negative for Russia. And it's my observation of the PRC leadership that they are very smart and very risk averse, much more risk averse than Putin, whom I agree with Eric is turning out to be a really bad friend if you're China. So, it seems to me that unless things turn radically in the next few weeks or months, that the lesson that PRC leaders are likely to take away is that this is not as easy as it looks, and we better be careful.
And will Xi Jinping drop Putin as a bad friend?
I think he's trying to walk the line. I think he's a frenemy right now. Little friend, little enemy.
Thanks very much. Let's open it up to questions. Kevin, I'm sure, has selected quite a few interesting questions. Kevin.
Thank you, Klaus. Yes, building on these connections we're making to Russia and Ukraine, one person wants to know, do you believe that the Taiwan people are committed to their national defense and are willing to defend their island and make the necessary sacrifices as per the Ukrainians in the resistance to the Russian invasion?
This is a question for Eric, but briefly, please.
The short answer is yes.
That's a brief answer. Thank you.
But sure, the short answer is yes. But I think, as a public servant, I think this is our job to inform people what is the price. And I think it is also our job to tell people how to avoid that before we actually have to go to that event, right? So it's stopping it before it happening, and in the event of a conflict, what's the price to pay? Because a lot of times, citizens are willing to do whatever to defend the country. They don't really know, what are the price they have to pay and what are actually will happen. So,
as we can see now in Ukraine, which is a very high price. Yeah, thank you very much. Can we have another question, please?
Yes. If China would invade Taiwan, what would be the biggest economic sanction that the US could impose on China?
June, do you have an answer for that?
No. Because in a way, China is already being punished by the sanctions that are on Russia.
All right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Shelley, you have an idea?
Yeah, it's a whole lot easier for the US to sanction Russia economically than to sanction China. Our economies are very much intertwined, of course, but it may be that for that very reason, economic sanctions, reduction in trade or even cessation of trade, that kind of sanction would be very high impact for China, precisely because China is so trade dependent and its trade is diverse across sectors and products as well as across countries. And the US has done economic sanctions against China. In the previous administration, there were significant tariffs on Chinese goods. And I think, it cost the Chinese economy something, even if it didn't change the PRC's behavior.
Didn't it also cost the American consumer an awful lot? And would the American consumer be prepared to pay an even steeper price for new sanctions?
Yeah, I don't know. The whole point of sanctions is that they cost everybody.
Well, again, I think sanctions is the wrong idea here, because Taiwan, as everyone has pointed out, and Ukraine are very different. And a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would be over very quickly.
Well,
missiles and so on. And so at that point, what good would sanctions do? Can the United States could they possibly say, we will cut off your access to X, Y, and Z unless you withdraw from Taiwan? You see what I mean? The situations are so different that the questions of sanction isn't really applicable.
Let me ask a different question away from warfare and sanctions, which are all, of course, negative parts of the international tools we have at our disposal. What can actually be done to de-escalate the situation? At the moment, we know tension in the South China Sea, in the Straits is actually increasing almost by the week. Which is not a good idea. So how can we de-escalate? How can both sides de-escalate? Or what is the solution here to bring a little bit more stability into the situation? Shelley.
What I think would be helpful would be, and actually I think this is happening. I mean, I think there has been some de-escalation, if not in the, I don't keep track of the number of PLA flights into Taiwan's air defense identification zone in the way that some others, including probably June, do. But it seems to me that the overall temperature in US-China relations has diminished a little bit recently. And that is partly because the other problems in the world have reminded leaders that, gratuitous conflict just to see what might happen can be very costly when some unexpected event occurs and suddenly you have to respond to that. So it seems to me that one thing that the US has been doing, especially in my view under the Biden administration has not been pro-China, that we haven't returned to the sort of status quo ante of the Obama era in terms of our China policy. But our officials have been somewhat more restrained or cautious, or at least coordinated in the statements that they make, such that I think the PRC leadership feels slightly less unstable about what the US might do. And I think that's positive, because I think a lot of the PRC's activity is aimed at demonstrating resolve and deterring actions that they are afraid could happen. And so if we can lower the temperature, then the need for that deterrence may also diminish.
Thank you, Eric. What is Taiwan's contribution to lowering the temperature? Is there one?
For lowering temperature, dialogue is always the way to go. But it's hard given the stance Xi Jinping currently is taken, and we don't know whether he will be more aggressive or not after the 20th Party Congress. But nevertheless, I think Taiwan, what we could do now is continue the dialogue and strengthen our security with Western allies. At the same time, we could be a gateway for the Western allies in communication with Beijing. But nevertheless, I think June has mentioned it. Republic of China is already an independent country, so maybe politically, if we stay this way, maintaining the status quo is a starter, and then I think democratizing mainland China is always a good way to mitigate peace and maintain our way of life.
Well, let's let that stand as it is and ask the next question instead of discussing that further, which we easily could. Maybe we can do that in connection with the next question. Kevin, please.
How secure is the production of semiconductors in Taiwan?
June.
It's very secure, but if there should be an invasion, it's not going to be. And this would be disastrous, not only for Taiwan, but for the People's Republic of China and for much of the rest of the world that relies on those chips. And I think the companies are doing what they can. I mentioned this plant being set up in Kumamoto. There is going to be another one being set up in Arizona. And so I know someone suggested that China could carry out a surgical strike against Taiwan without damaging the semiconductor industry. And to that I say, poppycock, it can't be done, okay? And so that is something that would definitely harm China as much as anybody else. And therefore, that's going to be a deterrent. Now, I also understand that the research on the highest of the high-end chips is done in Taiwan. So in other words, computer chips are manufactured in China, as a matter of fact, some of them, and some of them elsewhere. But the high end, the real cutting edge stuff is done in Taiwan, and that would be gone. And it would take something like 5 years to recoup any of that, not just the factories, but the expertise.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yeah. Let me ask for the next question. We are running out of time, so I need to rush you a bit. Yeah.
That's okay. No rush at all. But building on that, the next person wants to know that if the growing threat of China warrants more collective security in the Asia-Pacific region, such as an Asian NATO-CETO reboot.
Shelley, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, on the one hand, we are seeing an increase in collective security arrangements. So the AUKUS organization, the Quad, these are definitely aimed at showing common resolve among the US, Japan, Australia, the UK, variously configured, India, toward China. The Southeast Asian nations are a bit of a harder nut to crack because they have close political and economic ties to mainland China, and they have worked very hard to avoid taking sides or being too closely identified with one or the other. And, China has done a lot to make that hard for them, interfering in their territorial waters in the South China Sea. And, again, China's not a very good friend either, but when you're Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, Burma, Cambodia, etc., you're really not in a strong position to push the PRC away. So I think the kind of more Euro-American allied and Japan have an easier time. One interesting player that we haven't mentioned tonight is South Korea, where the government has really tried to avoid, again, taking too strong of a side. Despite being a military ally of the US, it continues to, try to preserve a good relationship with Beijing, not least because it's a huge economic partner to Korea. But public opinion in Korea, as in Japan, has turned really sharply against China. And the crazy political situation as manifested in today's presidential election in Korea, I think could make public opinion a bigger driver of Korean foreign policy. So it really depends on who you're talking about, I would say.
Thank you. When I listen to the conversation tonight, it's easy to receive the impression that we are moving towards a world divided into two. A Chinese sphere of influence and an American sphere of influence, with countries in the middle weighing to and fro, and often, of course, towards the United States. But is that sort of divided world, which, of course, reminds us to some extent of the traditional Cold War, but is that sort of divided world really the future? Is that what we really want? And would that avoid conflict? And we know during the Cold War, we almost came close to nuclear war. So is the likelihood of a huge nuclear scenario in such a newly divided world not high? So what can we do about it? June.
You said, is that what we want? And definitely it is not what we want.
How can we avoid it?
I predict that what will happen in the future is managed hostilities. In other words, we are not going to go nuclear. We are not going to start wars. We are just going to argue a lot, and there will be moments of feeling of crisis, but they will not spin out of hand. Now, unfortunately, any situation is always at the mercy of Clausewitz friction. Something you cannot predict is going to happen. And the United States, China, and Russia are not the only nuclear powers. You also have Iran, with the potential to act very dangerously, as Israel is constantly reminding us. And then there's...
Well, we have to, June, with all respect, we have to clarify that Iran is not yet a nuclear powers, but Israel and India and Pakistan and North Korea are. These are the countries which we should mention above all. We are trying to avoid Iran going nuclear. I think that is what the current debate is all about. But let me ask Eric about the division of the world. Is that where we're going to head to?
I think what we want is we want to avoid, the situation you just described. I think the world is much more interconnected today than during the Cold War era, and I think today a lot of issues that we are viewing are domestic, reflected in the international realm. So I think this is true for America. This is true for mainland China, right? I think, in my opinion, I think some might disagree with me. I think after Xi Jinping take the throne, I think the pressure will be taken off for him a little bit. So he will have some room to actually steer Beijing back to a normal course, though the opposite might happen. But nevertheless, I think, in Taiwan, we are looking at what the situation you described happening in our domestic politics. I think today, this anti-China campaign is real in Taiwan, and this is taking the majority opinion in Taiwan. So I think we want to do everything to avoid this, and think it takes everybody's wisdom to go over it.
Thank you. Shelley, can I ask this one?
Yeah, I think there's a way of viewing the Ukraine war as sort of starting something. Russia's taking the lid off and we're back. But another way to look at this is Russia is an outlier among countries. I think Putin is a desperate leader who is seeking to restore greatness to a failing state the Russian economy is bad. Russian society faces all kinds of pathologies and really tragic circumstances, which have a lot to do with the fact that Putin is their leader. The People's Republic of China is not like that, right? The People's Republic of China is a country that is in ascendant mode. I don't think it's overtaking the US. I've never bought the idea that China's GDP is going to surpass the US in a few years. I don't think China's GDP per capita will ever surpass the US, but China is a country that feels hopeful and imagines its own situation improving. And leaders in countries like that don't take life or death risks in order to make a point very often. And so, I think that I totally agree with Eric. Sorry, there's too much agreement between me and Eric for a debate, but I agree with Eric that we are too intertwined and entangled for it to be easy for most countries to act the way Russia is acting now. It is because of its isolation and disconnection that Russia was in a position to risk everything for.
Then wouldn't the lesson be that despite all the current tension and difficulties with Beijing, one should still engage in order to prevent that isolation?
I think we should engage, and I think we are engaged. We can't not engage because half the things I own are made in China. I am engaged with China in multiple ways throughout my daily life. And our government is engaged with China as well. But that doesn't mean that we have to say everything you do is great.
Absolutely,
right? It doesn't mean we have to excuse, for example, the Xinjiang catastrophe.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Let's take one final question, and then I would like you, when you answer the question, to connect that perhaps with some concluding remarks, how we can deal with Taiwan without it leading to any sort of unfortunate escalation, and try to perhaps keep the status quo with which we have lived for so long, which was somehow has suited us well despite all tension, but the status quo is apparently not a bad one. Kevin, do we have one final question?
We do. I don't know if it serves as the culminating question that you're looking for, but I think it's an interesting one. Does the Chinese treatment of its Uyghur population, labeling it a genocide, is that useful and productive for the relationship we're trying to cultivate with China?
Well, I leave it to Eric to find the connection between this question and concluding remarks on Taiwan.
The Uyghur situation shouldn't have any other political considerations and just call it what it is. What's happening there, we need to describe it, as a reality. And then connecting this to Taiwan, I think I kind of agree that maintaining status quo is the best option right now. As I describe it, I think we call it this infinite game. We want to continue the situation until the atmosphere has changed. I think this is the best for everybody to fit in the weather. Some might want to quit the game or end the game. I think that might quickly result in military conflicts. So you practice everybody's wisdom, and until things are changed in all players involved, Western allies, mainland China and Taiwan, maintaining status quo the way it is the best, though it is an evolving and progressing status quo.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. June, would you agree with that?
To a large extent, but I think we should keep in mind that the status quo is not static. And it will be okay for us to say we would like to maintain the status quo, but China may not want to maintain the status quo. So it's kind of like watching this game that loggers play where they're on a log in the middle of a lake and it's turning and you have to keep doing footwork. And so China wants to change the status quo. The United States doesn't want to change the status quo. And maintaining a static position is going to be very, very hard.
Thank you very much. Shelley, what do you say about that?
Yeah, the link I would make between the tragedy in Xinjiang and the situation in Taiwan is that there is still the possibility of some kind of reconciliation, I think, between Taiwan and something called China. Maybe not the People's Republic of China, but Taiwanese people still acknowledge that they have their roots, that most of them have their roots in China, that they are culturally and ancestrally Chinese. I think the biggest problem with cross-strait relations is the Communist Party, the Chinese Communist Party leadership, and the kind of society and polity that it has created in mainland China is absolutely repulsive to everyone that I know in Taiwan and nearly everyone who lives in Taiwan. So the Uyghur situation, Taiwanese look at that and they say, yeah, this is why, even if we have Chinese blood, as our Chinese cross the strait always tell us, even if we do have Chinese blood, we do not want to be part of the Chinese state that does things like this. Similarly, Hong Kong. So I think that the PRC will not make much progress in persuading Taiwanese people to imagine a different future between the two sides, as long as it is an authoritarian or worse state capable of actions like the extreme crimes against the Uyghur people, whatever we want to call them.
Thank you very much indeed. These were good concluding remarks. They've tried to pull the discussion a little bit together, but there are many questions we could still address, many issues we could still talk about. Maybe we should have a sequel in a few weeks' time. For now, I would like to thank our large audience, our large online audience, for sticking with us for almost an hour and a half, just under. Thank you very much for doing that. And in particular, I would, of course, like to thank Shelley Rigger and June Dreyer and Eric Yu-Chua Huang for joining us tonight and for being such good and interesting and lively candidates and panelists. Thank you very much indeed. I would like to point out to you before we go that there is a survey popping up on your screen, and the organizers would very much like you to fill in that survey. That seems to be the fashion these days. Then we do have a YouTube channel. You can see our debate again and again and again, if you can't get enough, on our YouTube channel. Well, have a good night, and thank you for joining us tonight. And thank you also, of course, to Kevin for asking the questions, and for Jonathan for overlooking our technical capabilities and making sure everything runs smoothly. So everyone, good night, and thank you very much for joining us tonight. Bye-bye.